Welcome to our Faith Formation series on dismantling racism at Grove United Methodist Church. For those of you who don't know me, I am Deacon Diana Esposito. I serve as the youth and young adult pastor at Grove, and I serve on the Eastern Pennsylvania Conference on Religion and Race. I'm really glad that Grove is incorporating the Dismantling Racism series at this time. The last week of our 4-week webinar on the topic of dismantling racism. You may see the last few weeks' information, racism, implicit bias, and systemic racism woven through today's topic because they are all intertwined. Next week, we will start 3 weeks of Zoom discussions to unpack what we've learned, to discuss current events, and to brainstorm Grove's next actions to dismantle racism. White privilege is our topic today. As we watch this video, we would encourage you to comment in the chat with 2 questions specifically for the first lesson, which are: how many steps forward could you have taken when you were college aged? And what is your reaction to this video? This activity gives one demonstration about what white privilege looks like. Although all of the statements were not directly about race, many of the statements made demonstrate the gaps many Black children experience. There's another activity that I've seen done as well, in addition to the race activity, is a seated activity in a classroom where the teacher at the front has asked every person to ball up a piece of paper, and there's a trash can at the front, and has said, seated where you are, anyone who can get their wadded up paper into the trash can will get $20. And immediately the people sitting in the back go, but wait, that's not real, or that's not fair. And the people sitting in front in these conversations following the activity almost always say they didn't think about the people sitting behind them. Not because they didn't want to think about the people sitting behind them, but they were so focused on their achieving that $20. In Hello Privilege, It's Me, Chelsea, and a Netflix special that I watched recently. Chelsea Handler and Tim Wise have a conversation where Tim Wise explains white privilege is a white person problem that has consequences for people of color. I mean, it becomes a problem for Black and brown folk because we don't deal with it, right? If we would deal with it, it wouldn't be a problem. But you can't solve a problem you won't name or that you won't even recognize is real. So here I am, naming that white privilege is a problem, giving it a name. Let's recognize this problem so we can start dealing with it, dismantling it even. And a side note about Hello Privilege, It's Me, Chelsea, great documentary. There is some language, so if you are squeamish about language, it may not be the documentary for you. Alan G. Johnson defines white privilege in his book, Privilege, Power, and Difference, as having a collection of benefits based on belonging to a group perceived to be white, when the same or similar benefits are denied to members of other groups, not because of what one's individual's accomplishments or actions. And that was something that they talked about in that first video, right? It is not because of something that you have done. It is not because of something that has been earned. It's just something that exists. White privilege is one of the identity privileges. Each are examples of other identity privilege that can afford privilege are race, religion, gender identity, sexual identity, class and wealth, physical ability, and citizen status. White privilege is often described through Peggy McIntosh's groundbreaking 1988 essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And if you have not had a chance to read that, I suggest you do. The article helps readers to recognize the invisible force that normalizes whiteness in the US culture. She describes white privilege as an invisible knapsack that she's been wearing and has been completely unaware of. An activity that I would encourage each of you to try is to take a piece of paper and fold it in half. On the left side, write all the ways in which you believe you are not privileged. Perhaps you are left-handed and often find yourself dragging your hand through ink, or you are female and have found yourself experiencing the gender wage gap. On the right side, write all the ways in which you do experience privilege. For many of you who identify as Christian in the US culture, that would be considered a privilege. For both columns, consider your race, your religion, your gender identity, your sexual orientation, your class and wealth, your ability, your body type, your neurological health, your education, your age, your citizen status, among others. It's important to recognize privilege is relative, and while we may benefit from some forms of privilege, we may not benefit from all forms of privilege. This, by the way, when we look at two places where they come together, if someone might be looking at being a person of color and being a female, or being a lesbian who is, you know, has mental health concerns. This is called intersectionality. Corey Collins, in the article titled, "What is White Privilege Really?" White privilege, the two-word term, packs a double whammy that inspires pushback. The word white creates discomfort among those who are not used to being defined or described by their race. And two, the word privilege, especially for poor and rural white people, sounds like a word that doesn't belong to them, like a word that suggests they have never struggled. The defensiveness derails the conversation, which means, unfortunately, that defining white privilege must often begin with defining what it's not. Otherwise, only the choir listens. The people you actually want to reach check out. White privilege is not the suggestion that white people have never struggled. Many white people do not enjoy the privileges that come with relative affluence, such as food security. Many do not experience the privileges that come with access, such as nearby hospitals. And white privilege is not the assumption that everything a white person has accomplished is unearned. Most white people who have reached a high level of success worked extremely hard to get there. Instead, white privilege should be viewed as a built-in advantage, separate from one's level of income or effort. When I first started serving on the Commission on Religion and Race, I was challenged to look at billboards as I drove around. I was challenged to look and see how many people of color I saw represented in billboards. while it started with billboards, it has grown for me. TV shows, movies, representatives in books, in clip art, in graphics on screens that I walk by. These are the types of things that once you start looking in specific areas become quite obvious everywhere. Corey Collins, who was the author of What is White Privilege Anyway, describes Peggy McIntosh's article as mostly a matter of cosmetics and inconvenience. That's what Peggy McIntosh's version of white privilege is. Those interruptions overshadow the origins of white privilege, says Collins, as well as its present-day ability to influence systemic decisions. They overshadow the fact that white privilege is both a legacy and a cause of racism. And they overshadow the words of many people of color who for decades recognized white privilege as the result of conscious acts and refused to separate it from historic inequities. One might ask, what legacy could have caused this privilege intentionally? Tim Wise, American anti-racist essayist, author, and educator, discusses very bluntly in his speeches and books the way in which the elite in the colonies intentionally split the interests of European and African indentured servants before race was a socially constructed idea. The elite plantation owners were concerned as rebellions were beginning to rise when they realized that they were outnumbered by black and white folks who are penniless, landless peasants. For this reason, the elite freed the European indentured servants and made them free laborers, providing them meager accommodations of land and granted them positions to enter into contracts, testify in courts, and serve on the slave patrols. Tim Wise states that the elite tricked the poor white, saying, "We still aren't going to really empower you or change your economic subordination, but we're going to make you honorary members of the team, and you're going to help us keep those other people down." And so they got a little taste of power, and it did effectively divide and conquer those coalitions, end quote. In Collins's article, he explained white privilege in 3 areas. The first is the power of normal. The power of normal includes things like the first aid kit having flesh-colored band-aids that only match the skin tone of white people. Bandages have been produced by Johnson & Johnson since 1921, and early advertising noted that they were almost invisible, which reinforces the idea of whiteness as the dominant culture. In fact, it was only after the death of George Floyd that Johnson & Johnson announced producing a line of bandages in light, medium, and dark tones. The products, as a second example, the products white people need for their hair is in an aisle labeled hair care, rather than in a smaller section labeled ethnic hair products. And in some stores, that smaller section is actually in a completely different aisle from hair care. Our third example is the grocery store stocking a variety of food options that reflect the cultural traditions of most white people, but not stocking many, if at all, foods that reflect the cultures of people of color. There's a quote from Collins that says, "The reason even these simple white privileges need to be recognized is that the damage goes beyond the inconvenience of shopping for goods and services. These privileges are symbolic of what we might call the power of normal. If public spaces and goods seem catered to one race and segregate the needs of people of other races into special sections that indicate something beneath the surface, white people become more likely to move through the world with an expectation that their needs be readily met. People of color move through the world knowing their needs are on the margins, Recognizing this means recognizing where gaps exist. The power of the benefit of the doubt. White people are also more likely to see positive portrayals of people who look like them on the news, on TV shows, and in movies. They're more likely to be treated as individuals rather than representatives of or exceptions to a stereotyped racial identity. In other words, they are more often humanized and granted the benefit of the doubt. They're more likely to receive compassion, to be granted individual potential to survive mistakes. This has negative effects for people of color who, without this privilege, face the consequences of racial profiling, stereotypes, and lack of compassion for their struggles. In these scenarios, white privilege includes the facts that A, white people are less likely to be followed, interrogated, or searched by law enforcement because they look suspicious, quote unquote. B, white people's skin tone will not be a reason people hesitate to trust their credit or their financial responsibility. C, if white people are accused of a crime, they are less likely to be presumed guilty, less likely to be sentenced to death, and more likely to be portrayed in fair, nuanced manner by media outlets. I find this one interesting, in particular, in looking at which pictures are chosen for the news. When a person of color is accused of a crime, the picture chosen is often a picture from provided by the police, whether that be a sketch or what is known as the mugshot. Whereas a white person, more often, the news will have a picture provided by an employer or from a family member. Something that humanizes the person who is being accused of a crime. The personal faults or missteps of white people will likely not be used to later deny opportunities or compassion to people who share their racial identity. This privilege is invisible to many white people because it seems reasonable that a person should be extended compassion as they move through the world. It seems logical that a person should have the chance to prove themselves individually before they are judged. It's supposedly the American ideal, but it's a privilege often not granted to people of color with dire consequences. The power of accumulated power. This section covers many of the areas in which we discussed last week with systemic racism: housing, education, wealth. I'm not going to delve into the depth again of accumulation of power and wealth, but no, we did struggle with which to teach first, white privilege or systemic racism, because they're interwoven. Let's watch another video clip now from the General Commission on Religion and Race's Vital Conversation series titled Deconstructing White Privilege with Dr. Robin DiAngelo. Dr. Robin DiAngelo is the author of a book called White Fragility, which I would suggest that if you have not yet read it, that you read it, especially for those people who are just learning about the topics. White fragility is defined as discomfort and defensiveness on the part of a white person when confronted by information about racial inequality and injustice. This white fragility is a normal reaction when having one's bubble burst about the fact that the way a white person experiences life in the United States is not the same way that a black or brown person experiences life in the United States. In the beginning of the video, Dr. DiAngelo discusses how post-Civil War racism morphed from overt actions to implicit bias and systemic racism. She also discusses the difficulty that puts on white people to discuss racism because it's become a moral issue. Being racist is bad, and if we're good people, well, how could that happen? In this video, she'll talk about a metaphor of a duck for white people's narratives about not being complicit in racist systems. White privilege is not just the power to find what you need in a convenience store or to move through the world without your race defining your interactions. It's not just the subconscious comfort of seeing a world that serves you as normal. It's also the power to remain silent in the face of racial inequality. It's the power to weigh the need for protest or confrontation against the discomfort or inconvenience of speaking up. It's getting to choose when and where you want to take a stand. It's knowing that you and your humanity are safe. And that's a quote from Collins. It was once said to me that white privilege is the privilege to learn about racism instead of experiencing it. The option to stop and think about racism. The option to say other things are more important and put it aside. While writing this lesson, I was asked to include this post from Facebook that has been circulating. I feel it really gives another perspective on privilege, which those who have lost their lives did not have the privilege. I have the privilege as a white person because I can do all of these things without thinking twice. I can go birding, Christian Cooper. I can go jogging, Ahmaud Arbery. I can relax in the comfort of my own home, Botham Shawn and Atiana Jefferson. I can ask for help after being in a car crash, Jonathan Farrell, Renisha McBride. I can have a cell phone, Stephen Clark. I can leave a party to get to safety, Jordan Edwards. I can play loud music, Jordan Davis. I can sell CDs, Alton Sterling. I can sleep, Ayanna Jones. I can walk from the corner store, Mike Brown. I can play cops and robbers, Tamir Rice. I can go to church, Charleston 9. I can walk home with Skittles, Trayvon Martin. I can hold a hairbrush while leaving my own bachelor party, Sean Bell. I can party on New Year's, Oscar Grant. I can get a normal traffic ticket, Sandra Bland. I can lawfully carry a weapon, Philando Castile. I can break down on a public road with car problems, Corey Jones. I can shop at Walmart, John Crawford. I can have a disabled vehicle, Terrence Crutcher. I can read a book in my own car, Keith Scott. I can be a 10-year-old walking with our grandfather, Clifford Glover. I can decorate for a party, Claude Reese. I can ask a cop a question, Randy Evans. I can cash a check in peace, Yvonne Smallwood. I can take out my wallet, Amadou Diallo. I can run, Walter Scott. I can breathe, Eric Garner. I can live, Freddie Gray. I can be arrested without the fear of being murdered, George Floyd. White privilege is real. Take a moment to consider a Black person's experience today. This one hit me really hard when I was reading it. There were many things in there that I have done without ever thinking twice about it. There are quite a number of these that talk about car-related things, getting a normal ticket, being pulled over, being able to ask a cop a question. And there was another book that I read through or listened through recently. Again, with a bit of color to the text. So if you are a person who is not a fan of color to text, in terms of it having language, I should say, then it might not be the book for you. But it's called So You Want to Talk About Race. And in this book, the author discussed what it was like to constantly be concerned about being pulled over. And one of the times when her brother got pulled over, and he calmly and collectedly said, "May I know what I'm being pulled over for?" And the police officer leaned into the car and said, "We're not going to have a problem now, are we?" It is not the regular experience of my white friends to have that kind of response, but my friends of color talk about that all of the time. Last week we talked about weathering, and that constant fear of being pulled over is something that provides or is part of that weathering experience. Real quick, before I go into our biblical connection today, there was a question that was posed, and that was, if United Methodists are declaring racism a sin, what steps toward reconciliation is the church making towards the African Methodist Episcopal Church, formed because the Methodist Episcopal Church was not welcoming? Some of you had the opportunity to go with confirmation students down to St. George's in Philadelphia and see the response or see the reenactments that they do. And there's definitely a part of that shows when the Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Church split, because the African Methodist Episcopal Church formed at that time. And there are, while I think that there's a lot more that can be discussed about what we can do, there are two things that I think that are important that have been steps, but obviously not far enough yet. And that is that the United Methodist Church has what's called open communion with the African Methodist, the AME Church. And that allows Methodists from either church, of course, to take communion. We have an open policy on communion, but it also allows the two churches to share pastors. So if someone was a pastor in the Methodist Episcopal Church and there was an appointment that they would like to take at the African Methodist Episcopal Church, that they would be, I should say, the United Methodist Church now, and but they could take appointments at the African Methodist Episcopal Church and their ordination would be recognized. The other part, and of course, way too late when it happened, it should have happened much earlier, but in 2009, October 25th, 2009, for the first time, the St. George's Church and the Mother Bethel African Methodist Episcopal Church worshiped together. And they have made that a regular step of something that they are, where they are starting. It's a starting point. There's definitely more work to be done. So our biblical connection today is from Acts 22. Up to this point, they listened to him, but then they shouted, "Away with such a fellow from the earth, for he should not be allowed to live." And while they were shouting, throwing off their cloaks and tossing dust up into the air, the tribune directed that he was to be brought into the barracks and ordered him to be examined by flogging to find out the reason for this outcry against him. But when they had tied him up with thongs, Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, "Is it legal for you to flog a Roman citizen who is uncondemned?" With that, when the centurion heard that, he went to the tribune and said to him, "What are you about to do? This man is a Roman citizen." The tribune came and asked Paul, "Tell me, are you a Roman citizen?" And he said, "Yes." The tribune answered, "It cost me a large sum of money to get my citizenship." Paul said, "But I was born a citizen." Immediately, those who were about to examine him drew back from him, and the tribune also was afraid, and he realized that Paul was a Roman citizen and that he had bound him. Since he wanted to find out what Paul was being accused of by the Jews, the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and the entire council to meet. He brought Paul down and had him stand before them. In the midst of a very upset crowd, Paul makes a rhetorical blunder by using the word Gentiles, and the crowd had an explosive reaction, calling for him to be killed. The tribune, presuming Paul is an Israelite, has Paul bound and prepares to flog him for answers. Paul uses his privilege as a Roman citizen to avoid such treatment. When the tribune speaks of the costly lengths he went through to gain his citizenship, Paul one-ups him, telling him that he was born a Roman citizen. Paul's ability to have the tribune listen to him about his status is a privilege that not all people of color in our modern day society have. While these people of color have equal rights under U.S. laws, they are not afforded the type of privilege that white folks are afforded. In the verses following this, when Paul is questioned by the council, he uses his privilege, his history of being a Pharisee and the son of a Pharisee, to cause social disruption by challenging the oppressive religious, social, and political status quo. This challenges us to think about how we're using our privilege to challenge oppressive systems. Let's close in prayer. Amazing and wonderful God, thank you so much for this space, for this time to be open and curious, for this time to dig deeper into what's invisible to us. Lord God, as we each sit on the edge of figuring out what this means for us, God, open our hearts and our minds, open our ears, and challenge us, God, to move through this space with you by our side. Remind us that when things seem tough and overwhelming, God, that you are here to hold us, to walk with us, and to guide us. God, we know that this might not be a straight through process. It's not like a connect the dots and A to B to C. We recognize that we might move forward and back through this process, Lord. So be there with us as we do, helping us to recognize what our next steps might be. I pray all these things in Jesus' name, amen.